The first funeral. The January wind screamed through Milbrook like something alive that night, rattling shutters and whistling through the cold tipples on the edge of town. Snow crusted over the dirt roads, muffling footsteps, yet nothing could quiet the steady, hollow ring of St. Stephen's church bell. It told a slow, deliberate rhythm that carried through the valley, announcing another death, the 14th since the start of winter. The sound wasn't just mournful, it was accusing, as if calling out the living one by one. Inside the church, the air was heavy with damp wool and coal dust, the heat from the iron stove fighting a losing battle against the bitter cold. Families filled the pews, their faces shadowed under wide-brimmed hats and soot-stained scarves, hands clasped tightly as though prayer might shield them from whatever invisible plague stalked Milbrook streets. At the front, under a wash of candlelight, a coffin rested, plain pine hastily made, its lid nailed shut far too quickly for comfort. Reverend Marcus Thompson stood above it, his tall frame cutting a severe figure against the altar. His silver hair gleamed like ice in the lamplight, and when he spoke, his voice carried with the weight of both comfort and command. "Death comes for us all," he intoned, his pale blue eyes sweeping across the congregation. "But we are not abandoned. Each soul we bury here is gathered to the Lord, safe beyond the reach of suffering. And yet—" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble. "It is not enough to weep and move on. We must prepare for tomorrow." The words landed like stones in the silence that followed. Everyone knew what he meant. The insurance fund, the one thing keeping widows fed and children clothed when death struck too soon. And lately, death seemed to strike every other week. That night a storm battered Milbrook until dawn, covering the fresh grave in St. Stephen's yard with a pristine layer of snow. By morning, there were no footprints left to mark where the mourners had stood, no sign that anything, or anyone, had been laid to rest. And for Thomas McKenna, a miner who passed the graveyard on his way to the pits, that emptiness felt wrong. Wrong enough to make him stop, wrong enough to make him shiver despite his heavy coat. 3 weeks later, he would swear he saw the man they buried, alive. The men who shouldn't be walking. Snowmelt slicked the cobblestones on Elm Street, turning the early spring rain into a slow gray ooze that clung to boots and bones alike. The black skeletons of bare trees clawed at the low sky as if trying to drag down the clouds themselves. In that murky light, Milbrook looked less like a town than a half-forgotten sketch someone had tried to erase. It was in this slanting drizzle that Thomas McKenna saw him again. James Morrison. 3 weeks buried, body nailed into a coffin that had been lowered under the frozen earth while the bell tolled slow and grim. Yet here he was. Same peculiar limp, same sloping shoulders trudging down the railway embankment as though he'd merely stepped out for air. His face was turned away, but even from 30 paces McKenna could feel it was him. The same way you recognize a childhood friend from the angle of his walk long before you see his features. "James!" he barked, voice echoing hollow off the wet rails. The figure did not turn. It simply kept walking until the fog swallowed it whole. McKenna stood rooted, cold sinking into his marrow. When at last he made himself move, the embankment ahead was empty, the rails humming softly with distant thunder from the mines. He told no one. What could he say? That death had clocked out early, that the grave had coughed him back up, and yet he was not alone. Over the next weeks, whispers began circulating like stray coal dust on the wind. Mrs. Agnes Fletcher claimed she saw her dead son Benjamin standing at her kitchen window, watching her scrub the floor with an expression she couldn't read. Old Mario Sullivan swore her husband Patrick, entombed after a cave-in last winter, had bought flour and kerosene in Centria, 40 miles away. She described him as thinner, almost hollow-looking, but certain it was him. Every story shared the same strange details. The dead were always seen from a distance, never answering when called, always vanishing when approached, as if they were actors who forgot their lines and fled the stage. And when these stories reached Reverend Thompson, he did what he always did best, turned unease into doctrine. The mind in grief seeks comfort where none exists. he said from the pulpit one rain-slick Sunday, his voice sonorous over the drone of the storm. You see shapes through tears, shadows wearing familiar faces. These are not your loved ones walking. They are your longing, nothing more. The congregation nodded, relieved to have their fears dressed in theology. But one person did not nod. Rebecca Morrison. She sat stiff-backed near the back, black gloves clasped in her lap like coiled snakes. Her James had died. Really died, they'd said, crushed by a falling timber. She had stood at the grave. She had heard the dull thud of earth on wood. And yet last week a traveling salesman passing through Milbrook had mentioned, in casual half-drunk gossip, that a miner named James Morrison from the Schuylkill Valley had been hired near Centria. Rebecca had smiled politely and poured him more coffee. Then she had not slept for 3 nights. By the 4th night she stopped trying. Instead she took her late husband's lantern, wound her black shawl around her face, and walked out toward St. Stephen's Cemetery, under a moon thin as a scythe. The graves lay in neat rows like soldiers asleep at attention, the snow gone now, leaving only the hard clay and cracked stones. The night air smelled of iron and damp wood, and somewhere deep in the dark, a whippoorwill called once and then went silent, as if it had thought better of it. Rebecca stood over James's grave. Her hands were trembling, though from cold or fear she couldn't tell. She tried to pray, but the words turned to grit in her mouth. She knelt instead, pressing her ear to the earth. And there, faint as a breath, she heard nothing. Not the echo of worms, not the seep of soil. Only an emptiness so perfect it made her stomach drop, as though the earth below her was hollow. She rose slowly, lantern held tight, and realized something was terribly, terribly wrong. The cross marker was leaning ever so slightly as if the soil had settled unevenly, or had never been disturbed at all. Behind her something shifted in the trees, a branch cracking, or footsteps on the frost-hardened ground. "James?" she whispered. The lantern sputtered. The sound stopped, and when she turned there was no one behind her. Yet the earth around the grave showed no footprints but her own. Rebecca did not scream, though she wanted to. She walked back to town, each step measured and stiff, like balancing on a tightrope above a black pit. By dawn, she knew only one thing for certain. If James Morrison was alive, then the coffin buried behind St. Stephen's was empty. And if it was empty, she had to prove it, even if it meant digging through the dead to find the living. The ledger of Ghost Milbrook's mornings were all the same. Coal dust drifting like phantom snow, the shrill mine whistle ripping through the valley, and shop doors creaking open under skies the color of cold iron. But for Rebecca Morrison, the sameness had cracked. The town she had once known as weary but honest now felt curated, like a painting hiding a tear beneath its frame. And if there was a tear, she intended to pull it wide open. She began not with a shovel, but with silence. Silence was safer. Silence could slip into places suspicion could not. By day, she tended her boarding house, smiling at traveling salesmen, nodding at miners' wives who called her a model of fortitude. But by night she slipped like smoke through Milbrook's forgotten corners, the town clerk's office when he stepped away for whiskey, the record shelf in the postmaster's back room, the musty archives of the county library where the oil lamps burned low and mice darted between crumbling ledgers, and in those brittle pages she found what she had half dreaded and half hoped for: gaps, holes, cut neatly into the town's paper skin birth, certificates with no matching death entries with no attending physician listed, insurance payouts scrawled in the margins in Reverend Thompson's neat upright hand. It was all there, like bones showing through thin flesh. One name stopped her cold. Benjamin Fletcher, age 17, pronounced dead of a sudden fever in 1871. Rebecca remembered the funeral vividly. Thompson had spoken of God plucking a bright flower before the frost. While the boy's mother had sobbed so violently, 2 women had to hold her upright. But the county ledger showed something else. A death certificate signed by Dr. Cornelius Whitman, and beneath it, in the adjacent column, a mining payroll from West Virginia dated 18 months later. Benjamin Fletcher, shift worker, tunnel number 4. Rebecca's throat went dry. The boy who had been plucked by God had been digging coal in another state, long after his grave was closed. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to make her hands shake as she closed the ledger and tucked her lantern under her shawl. She began building what she called, only to herself, the ledger of ghosts. Scraps of names, dates, newspaper clippings, insurance notices, every piece of evidence that hinted at something unholy beneath Milbrook's polite surface. And all the while, she felt it. The weight of unseen eyes. At first it was just the sense of being watched when she crossed the square at dusk. Then came the shadows that seemed to withdraw when she turned her lantern on them. The mail on her doorstep arriving opened and clumsily resealed. The sudden silence whenever she entered the general store, as if conversations had been snuffed out mid-sentence. Once, as she unlocked her boarding house after a midnight trip to the archives, she found the door already unlatched. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been moved, except the photograph of James on her mantel, which now lay, face down on the floor. Rebecca understood, then, that her hunt was no longer secret. Someone, maybe more than one, knew she was digging, and they were letting her know they knew. But stopping wasn't an option anymore, because the more names she uncovered, the more impossible the numbers became. 14 funerals in Thompson's first winter, 37 in the 2 years after, and not one body ever viewed by anyone outside Crow's undertaker parlor. The pattern was there, coiling tighter with every night of research, and at its heart, like a spider crouched on invisible threads, was Reverend Marcus Thompson. So she decided to go straight to the Webb's Center. On the first Sunday of April, Rebecca put on her best morning dress and attended St. Stephen's for the first time since James's funeral. The church smelled of damp wood and candle smoke. Thompson stood at the pulpit in his gleaming vestments, his voice rolling over the congregation like warm honey. Even in sorrow, he preached, there is order. God builds his kingdom stone by stone, each life placed precisely where it must be. Rebecca sat perfectly still, eyes on him, and thought, and you've been laying your stones inside coffins. After the service, she lingered near the church office, pretending to admire the stained glass windows while the last parishioners drifted out into the drizzle. When the hallway was empty, she slipped inside. The office smelled of ink and iron stove ash. Neat stacks of ledgers lined the shelves, their spines labeled in Thompson's exacting hand. She moved quickly, fingers cold and slick, scanning until she found it. Burial Register 1867-1873. Her breath hitched. This was it, proof. She cracked it open wide and froze. Every page had been razor-sliced out, leaving only the leather binding and a thin edge of paper like trimmed fingernails. Something creaked behind her. Rebecca spun. Reverend Thompson stood in the doorway, his pale eyes catching the lantern glow. He smiled, faint and polite, but not surprised. "Mrs. Morrison," he said softly, "you've been keeping late hours." Rebecca's heartbeat thundered so hard she felt it in her teeth. Thompson stepped fully into the office, closing the door behind him with a click that sounded like the snap of a coffin latch. "Perhaps," he murmured, "we should talk about what you've been looking for." The shepherd's mask. The office door clicked shut behind Reverend Thompson, and the sound was so soft, so gentle, that it somehow made Rebecca's skin crawl worse than if he'd slammed it. He moved with the careful grace of someone used to commanding rooms without raising his voice. Tall and immaculate in his vestments, his silver hair immaculate even as a storm rattled the windows. For a moment he simply regarded her, head tilted slightly as though she were a curious insect that had wandered somewhere it shouldn't. "You've been very diligent," he said at last, each word clipped and precise like coins being placed on a table. The clerk's ledgers, the burial register, newspaper clippings from Harrisburg. His pale eyes glinted. Even the payroll records from Centria. Rebecca's breath caught. He knew. Somehow he knew. "I don't know what you mean," she managed, though her voice sounded brittle in her own ears. Thompson's smile was faint, almost sorrowful. "Please, Mrs. Morrison. Deceit is a sin, and it sits poorly on you." You were not meant for lies, Rebecca's mind churned. How could he know? Had someone followed her? Or, she realized with an icy drop in her stomach, of course. The opened door, the turned-over photograph. He'd already been in her house. Thompson circled slowly around the office, fingertips brushing the polished edge of his desk. "I admire your spirit," he said. "It reminds me of Job, railing against God's plan, demanding an explanation he could not possibly comprehend. The Lord rewards such persistence when it serves his design." "God has nothing to do with what you've done," Rebecca said, and was astonished to find her voice steady. "The dead don't walk, which means they were never in those graves at all." Thompson paused, looking at her as though weighing the precise shape of her soul. "The dead don't walk," he agreed softly, "but the living can be guided." He opened a desk drawer and drew out a small leather book. It looked innocuous. Scuffed corners, brass clasp, pages yellowed with use. He placed it on the desk between them like an offering. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. Rebecca shook her head, eyes locked on the book as though it might bite. "This," Thompson said, "is my shepherd's register. Every name, every soul I have guided from despair to providence. 143 so far. Soon to be more." He undid the clasp with a quiet snap and opened to a page near the middle. Rebecca's stomach lurched. Each entry was in Thompson's meticulous hand. Name, fictional cause of death. Insurance amount, destination, and beside them, a final column marked purpose fulfilled. Some were ticked. Some weren't. James Morrison's name stared back at her, ink sharp as a blade. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Because despair breeds waste," Thompson said simply. "Men who would rot in debt and sickness instead build the world you see around you. Families are saved, children fed, a clean exchange, a holy symmetry." He looked at her with that faint, sad smile again. "Do you see? I have merely redirected tragedy." Rebecca felt the floor tilting beneath her. This wasn't guilt speaking. It wasn't even madness. It was worse, he believed it. "You sold them," she said. "You sold human lives like livestock." "Livestock are not mourned," Thompson replied gently. "My flock is wept for, prayed over, and honored as martyrs. The world forgets most men before the soil finishes swallowing them. I have made sure these men are remembered." Something creaked behind her, the faint whisper of the door unlatching. She risked a glance. Samuel Crow, the undertaker, filled the doorway, broad and heavy-shouldered in his black coat, his hands hanging like dull iron at his sides. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were flat chips of slate. Rebecca's heartbeat surged. They were flanking her, boxing her in like a deer between hounds. Thompson closed the little ledger with a soft thud. "I will tell you something, Mrs. Morrison," he said, leaning closer, and for the first time his voice carried no warmth at all. It was the voice of stone on stone. "You are alive right now only because you are useful, you are clever, and you are respected, and if you chose to become an ally, you could save many children from starving this winter." "And if I refuse?" she said. Thompson's smile returned, faint and precise. "Then we bury you too, and we make sure the coffin is not empty." Rebecca felt her own pulse hammering in her throat like a trapped bird. She kept her gaze locked on his, refusing to blink. "If you touch me," she whispered, "I will drag you to hell with me." For a heartbeat, something flickered in Thompson's pale eyes. Not fear, but recognition. A spark of the same ruthless resolve he'd built his empire upon. Then he straightened, smoothing his vestments as though brushing off dust. "You have 3 days to decide," he said. "Be wise with them." Crow opened the door. Cold wind knifed through the office. Rebecca stepped past him, never turning her back until she was in the hall. Only when she was halfway down Elm Street did her knees buckle, and she had to lean against a lamppost, gasping 3 days, 3 days before they buried her alive. The widow's war by the following dawn. Rebecca Morrison was no longer the woman Thompson had threatened. The fear had burned out of her like fever. What was left behind was cold and sharp. She knew 3 things with perfect clarity. No law in Milbrook could stop Thompson. He was the law here. No plea for mercy would sway him. He believed he was God's right hand. And if she waited, he would kill her. So she would not wait. She would move first. Her first act was the most dangerous, choosing whom to trust. Milbrook was a closed loop of loyalties, men who mined together, prayed together, drank together. But one thread hung loose from the weave. Daniel Walsh, her late husband's brother. Daniel had worked as a foreman before a collapsed beam crushed his leg, and he'd spent the past year in bitter exile from the mines, drinking cheap whiskey and muttering about How things don't add up around here. Rebecca found him in his half-collapsed barn at the edge of town, oil lamp guttering in the gloom, surrounded by rusted tools and the smell of wet hay. He looked up from his bottle as she entered, one eyebrow lifting. "You look like someone about to set fire to the world," he said. "Only a small part of it," she replied. She told him everything. The fake burials, the ledgers, Thompson's threats. At first Daniel only laughed, a dry, bitter sound like old paper tearing. But when she showed him the payroll slip for Benjamin Fletcher and the photograph of Morrison's grave beside a coffin-shaped depression of untouched earth, his expression drained to cold disbelief. "Holy God," he whispered. "They really did it. They're still doing it," Rebecca said. "And if I vanish in the next 3 days, you tell everyone." Everyone. Daniel straightened, the old steel of the foreman glinting faintly through his weariness. "No, we won't wait for you to vanish." Their plan unfolded like a whisper, through dead leaves. Rebecca used her boarding house as cover. Its parade of traveling salesmen and railway clerks provided perfect camouflage for secret meetings. They came after dark, quiet as conspirators. Daniel on his cane, Agnes Fletcher with her shawl pulled low, and eventually even Thomas McKenna, haunted-eyed and trembling, still muttering about seeing James Morrison alive on the Centria tracks. They became her hidden council, her circle of the living, and together, they began bleeding Thompson's machine. Agnes worked in the postmaster's office and began quietly rerouting Thompson's correspondence to them before delivery. Rebecca smuggled the letters under trays of bread to her attic, where Daniel slit them open with a razor and copied their contents by candlelight. What they found was worse than anything Rebecca had imagined. Thompson had buyers. Real buyers. Men in distant towns paying him for replacements, whole families marked as dead, shipped off to nameless mines. One letter chilled her marrow. A requisition from a Colonel Harrison Blackwood requesting no fewer than 30 strong backs, with wives preferred to tend the barracks. Rebecca stared at those words for a long time, the flame of the candle quivering in the drafts, and thought, they're not even people anymore to him. They're units. Next they moved to the cemetery. It had to be done carefully. Crow practically lived on those grounds, but Rebecca knew his rhythms now. He drank at the tavern every Wednesday night until the lamps went out. That gave them a window. They came with shovels muffled in rags. The earth was cold and stubborn, but grief lent their muscles fury. They dug in silence, breath smoking in the moonlight, until the coffin lid emerged like a black tooth. Daniel pried it open. Inside were not bones, not flesh. Only stones, arranged in the vague geometry of a human form. Rebecca's stomach turned, but her voice was steady. "Photograph it." McKenna did, hands shaking as he held the flash lamp. The burst of light seared the trees, casting their twisted shadows across the gravestones like clutching fingers. They sealed the coffin again, tamped the earth smooth, and vanished before dawn. By sunrise, Rebecca had hidden the photograph beneath a false floorboard in her attic, the first shard of irrefutable proof, and still the danger pressed closer. She began finding signs. Boot prints under her window. The smell of pipe smoke in her stairwell, though none of her boarders smoked. Once, waking in the black hour before dawn, she glimpsed the silhouette of a tall man on the street below, just standing there, watching her house until the clouds swallowed the moon and he was gone. They were closing in, which is when Rebecca decided to set a snare. She forged a letter in Thompson's style, complete with his immaculate penmanship, a skill she'd secretly practiced for weeks using scraps of his sermons lifted from the church bulletin board. The letter was addressed to Colonel Blackwood, offering a shipment of 23 souls to depart Milbrook within the fortnight. Then she slipped that false letter into Thompson's outgoing mail bag. 2 nights later, Agnes intercepted the return post. The answer made Rebecca's blood run cold. Confirmed. Payment on delivery. Use line 7, minimal oversight. Line 7. Rebecca had seen that name once, scribbled in the margin of one of Crow's funeral ledgers. A freight line, disused for coal shipments years ago, completely abandoned. They had just handed her the route. The decision that followed felt like falling. They would let the next funeral proceed. They would follow the coffin, and they would find out where Thompson's ghosts went when they slipped out of their graves. Rebecca stood at her attic window that night, staring down at the dark husk of St. Stephen's through the mist. The lanterns long since gone out. The wind moaned down Elm Street like a lost soul. Not ghosts, she whispered to the empty room. Prisoners. And somewhere deep in the night, faint and distant, she swore she heard the slow chime of a funeral bell, ringing for the living. The hollow procession, the night of the funeral, was windless and too still, the air like glass that hadn't decided whether to shatter. Rebecca watched from the shadowed trees at the cemetery's edge. Shawl pulled tight, heart thudding a raw tattoo. Crow's lantern bobbed along the row of stones as he and 2 hired men carried the coffin. There was no family present, no mourners. The widow had been sent away earlier, soothed by Thompson's velvet assurances. The coffin looked heavy, but Rebecca knew better. She stayed low as they lowered it into the earth, listened to the dull thud of shovels, the muffled grunt of effort, and then the sharp metallic clack of a lock being fastened to something unseen beneath the grave. Crow glanced over his shoulder, then led the men away. The lantern glow receded like a sinking star, leaving only the cemetery's black silence. Rebecca exhaled, her breath trembling white. It was time. The next part of the plan was pure madness, and they all knew it. Daniel, limping and grim, was already crouched by the freight spur half a mile outside town, the abandoned Line 7. Agnes waited with their single borrowed horse and a creaking coal cart. McKenna knelt by the rails, hands shaking as he checked the trap he'd built from leftover blasting powder and a stolen detonator. They looked like ghosts themselves in the mist, ragged and pale, the last fragments of Milbrook's forgotten souls. At exactly midnight, the earth began to hum. The sound was distant at first, like a bee trapped under glass, then grew deep and relentless, until the rails trembled under their boots. Out of the fog came the train, a squat black engine with its headlamp extinguished, moving silent and lightless as a phantom. No whistle, no bell, no markings, only the hiss of steam and the grinding of iron. Rebecca's breath caught as the cars passed. The third one had vent slats. Something pale clutched the bars for an instant. Fingers, human fingers, skeletal and desperate, and then gone. They weren't coffins on this train. They were people, still alive. Rebecca's whole body locked like stone. It was worse than she had imagined. Not just abduction, trafficking, a conveyor belt of the living, shuttled into oblivion. Now, Daniel hissed. McKenna's trembling thumb pressed the detonator. The night cracked open in fire and thunder. The rails bucked. The third car jumped its track with a scream of tortured metal, spilling sideways in a blizzard of splinters. Horses screamed in the distance. The engine shrieked as the brakes bit steel, sparks blooming like dying stars. Rebecca was already running, skirts whipping her ankles as the world drowned in smoke. The car door was barred from outside. Daniel hacked through the beam with a rusted axe. The impact jarred his bad leg and drew a strangled snarl from him, but he kept swinging. On the third blow, the beam shattered. The door sagged open. They were inside. Half a dozen men blinked at the sudden light, gaunt, gray-skinned, eyes huge in hollow sockets. Shackles ringed their ankles. One stared up at Rebecca as though looking at the sun for the first time and croaked, Are we dead?" "No," she whispered, throat raw. "Not yet." Then her gaze snagged on a seventh figure curled in the far corner and her heart nearly stopped. James. His beard was ragged, his shoulders slumped like broken scaffolding. But his eyes, God, his eyes, the same deep brown that had once looked at her across their kitchen table alight with laughter. "Becca," he rasped, disbelief cracking the word. She fell to her knees beside him. "Yes, it's me. It's over." But even as the words left her lips, she knew they were a lie, because from down the track came another sound, the clatter of hooves, the thunder of boots. Thompson was coming. The woods exploded in chaos. Crow's bellow cut through the smoke. "Stop them!"
"Kill the evidence!"
Gunshots cracked, ricocheting off derailed iron. Sparks sprayed as bullets struck rails. Daniel shoved Rebecca behind the coal cart, snarling, "Get them out! I'll hold them!" "No!" she screamed, but he was already up, limping toward the trees with a torch clutched in one hand like a sword of fire. The shadows of men surged to meet him. Agnes and McKenna dragged the freed captives toward the tree line. cutting their shackles with stolen bolt cutters. James stumbled at Rebecca's side, every step a groan. They crashed through the brambles just as the derailed train erupted in a second blast, Daniel's last hidden charge. The explosion tore the night apart, a sheet of orange flame flaring high enough to paint the clouds. When Rebecca looked back through the heat shimmer, she saw Thompson on horseback at the edge of the inferno, his silver hair catching the firelight. His face as calm as an icon in a cathedral. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He just watched her go, and he smiled. By dawn, they had made it to the next town, where Rebecca slammed a bundle of photographs, ledgers, and letters down on the desk of the startled constable and said, with a voice that shook only from exhaustion, "They're alive. The coffins are empty, and Reverend Marcus Thompson has sold half of Milbrook." The investigation detonated across Pennsylvania like a mine collapse. What they unearthed became headlines from Philadelphia to Chicago. The empty graves, the fraudulent death certificates, the network of slave labor camps threaded through 3 states. The newspapers called it the Hollow Procession, a phrase that seemed to follow Rebecca everywhere, whispered like a curse. Thompson was arrested 2 weeks later in his church office, sitting calmly at his desk, writing his Sunday sermon as if nothing had happened. He went to trial and then to prison. Whitman was dragged down with him, and Crow. Blackwood fled and was never found. Dozens of survivors crawled out of the dark pits where they had been worked half to death. Some returned home. Some vanished into distant cities, unable to face the families who had mourned them. James lived another 7 years. He never truly recovered from the mines, but some nights Rebecca caught him smiling quietly in his sleep, and that was enough. St. Stephen's Church rotted, then collapsed under its own silence. Only the graveyard remains now, row upon row of headstones standing over earth that holds nothing at all. And here is the final, strangest thing. On quiet nights, the locals swear they hear the faint chime of funeral bells drifting from those abandoned stones, though no bell has hung in St. Stephen's steeple for over a century. And so ends the story of Milbrook, a town that buried empty coffins, full of stones, and a secret heavier than any grave could hold. Because evil doesn't always come with claws or fangs. Sometimes it comes wearing vestments and smiling gently as it takes your hand.